And you graduated in 16.
Good afternoon, everyone. You can tell this was an elementary school, right? Everybody knows how to respond when the teacher says something. So welcome. My name is Amy Schweitzer, and I am the director here at the Shaker Heights Public Library. So I want to welcome you all here to our beautifully renovated Shaker Library. We just reopened looking like this in 2021. So pleased to have so many of you in the building with us today. And I know we have a lot of folks tuning in from home as well. So I want to welcome everyone. And we know that many of Paul's 50th reunion classmates are in the audience today. Thank you all for joining us. And speaking of renovations, I do want to announce that the construction at our Bertram Woods Branch Library is finished. Move-in starts next week, and we do plan to reopen the branch on schedule in early October. So stay tuned. We'll be sending things out on social media and via email as we get closer to the date. I also want to be sure that you know about some upcoming Shaker author programming this fall, when we hope you can join us for that too. On September 6th, we're hosting Bert Griffin, who will discuss his new book, JFK, Oswald, and Ruby, Politics, Prejudice, and Truth. On September 30th, we'll host Vijay Shah, who created the new graphic novel, Man on a Mission, James Meredith and the Battle of Ole Miss. And on October 16th, Wesley Lowry will join us to discuss his new book, American White Lash, A Changing Nation and the Cost of Progress. So we're all about the authors here at Shaker Library. Today, I also want to acknowledge and thank our event co-sponsors, the Shaker Historical Society and the Ludlow Community Association. Also our book sales partner, Loganberry Books, and the Friends of Shaker Library, who are also helping us today. And if you want to become a friend of Shaker Library, just check in with one of them. And I also want to thank all of the library staff who have spent so much time moving all the shelves, so much time organizing and arranging this event. And in particular, I want to thank Megan Hayes and Lindsay Brennan for their really hard work today. Laura Meckler spent many, many hours in this building working on this book. She used the archival resources in our local history collection to help her tell this story. And we're happy that she found our materials and staff to be helpful and grateful to be acknowledged in her book. Thank you. And before I introduce our speakers today, I just also want to go over some logistics. Paul and Laura are going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then they're going to take questions from the audience here and also from our online audiences. Books are for sale behind me. They're back over here. Behind here, we have Loganberry. And Laura has graciously agreed to sign books. So she will be at the table over here to my right, under the grand staircase. And staff will help you form a line towards her table along the east side of the building. And staff will also have Post-it notes and pens. So if you want to write what you would like the inscription to be, you can do that. Restrooms, very important, over here to the right on the first floor and on the second floor. And I also, since we have a great crowd here today, our safety manager would think I was remiss if I did not tell you about the emergency exits. So in case of an emergency, there are visible emergency exit signs. There's an emergency exit over here to my right, your left. The front door you came in is an emergency exit, and there is also an emergency exit through the checkout area. So should there be an emergency, our staff will assist, but just stay calm. But I don't think there's going to be an emergency. I think there's just going to be an amazing talk. So now that I've got all the housekeeping out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guests. So Paul Mason spent 3 decades working for ABC News as a producer, executive producer, and senior vice president. Based in London, New York, Miami, Johannesburg, and Berkeley, his award-winning work for World News Tonight with Peter Jennings and other programs included reporting on politics, race, human rights, proxy wars in Latin America, apartheid, and free elections in South Africa, and much more. He also produced a short film called The Reunion about his Ludlow kindergarten classmates and integration in Shaker schools that aired on ABC Television Network in 2004. And Laura Meckler is a national education writer for the Washington Post, where she covers the news, politics, policies, and people shaping American schools. She previously reported on the White House, presidential politics, immigration, and healthcare for the Wall Street Journal, as well as on health and social policy for the Associated Press in Washington. Her honors include a Nieman Fellowship and a Livingston Award for National Reporting, and she was part of a team that won the George Polk Award for Justice Reporting. She got her start at the Canton Repository and also covered state politics in Columbus early in her career. Laura grew up in the Sussex neighborhood of Shaker Heights and went to Shaker schools from kindergarten through 12th grade. She lives in Washington, D.C. with her husband and 2 sons, but comes back to the area often to visit family and friends. So please join me in welcoming Paul and Laura. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Before we get going, I just want to say a huge thank you to the Shaker Library for just pulling off this event. Just incredible. I'm so grateful. I was already incredibly grateful to Megan Hayes, who's going to be maybe annoyed because I'm singling her out yet again, but she is an amazing resource for this community. Her collection in the local history collection that she has both online and back up there in the Moreland room is absolutely stunning. It's just fascinating to read through. If you are at all a history buff, just, carve out an hour to come look through some of this stuff. It's fantastic. And it was absolutely essential to my work. So I just wanted to say thank you to Megan and to the library for doing this event.
We have some news. And so I thought that perhaps we should at least start by touching a little bit on it, and then we'll come back to it. But and maybe you would prefer to characterize it in a different way.
Well, my bar for news might be just like, I'm not sure I call it news, but we do have we have current events. I think it's fair to say.
We have current events.
Right. And I guess Paul and I were talking about how, a lot of people here are think about Shaker from 50 years ago when they were in high school. And a lot of people are here because they have kids in the school now, or they're in maybe we have current students in the school. And so there are also current controversies happening. So I think we're going to get to the current events, the detracking, perhaps the facilities plan. We'll talk about that as we get deeper into the program.
So stay tuned. In the meantime, quickly, I wanted to know, how many in the audience here either have children or grandchildren in the Shaker schools? And do we have any current or former Shaker teachers, administrators? And what about alums? Oh yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you. I appreciate that. That helps us gauge a little bit. And I just wanted to say, so I've read Laura's book, and this book, first of all, she's a great reporter and she's done a wonderful job. But I also think that it is tremendously informed by the fact that she's the national education reporter for the Washington Post and has studied schools across our country for the past 5 years. And so in virtually every single chapter, there is certainly stories that are current and are here, but there is also a larger umbrella in which a larger tableau that she's telling this story, contextualizing what's happening here. And I think it's pretty extraordinary. So I want to say thank you.
Thank you.
But tell me this, are we an anomaly?
Yeah, in many ways we are. Most of the country, you have kids who are wealthy, usually white, gathering together in school districts of their own, and you have poor districts, families from kids from low-income families, usually children of color in districts of their own. Now, there are obviously this is not not unique. There are other diverse communities as well, but we have desegregation in this country peaked in 1988 when federal courts started letting school districts out of their court orders. And we have not, there in most of the country, not only is our schools not integrated, but that isn't even necessarily a goal. People go looking for houses in places where everybody will be like them. That is the typical pattern in this country. So yes, I think a community like Shaker Heights which for many, many years, for decades now, has been both racially and economically diverse, is something unusual. And that's, I think, a large part of why this is a story worth telling.
So the title it certainly stands out. So tell us, why did you title it Dreamtown?
Yeah, it stands out because the design is in like 48-point type. It's like, you're not going to miss this. The original title was inspired by an article in Cosmopolitan magazine in 1963. Now, this article came about because in 1960, the census found that Shaker Heights was the wealthiest city in America, which is pretty remarkable. But it was literally the wealthiest city in America, which is why probably, if you've, for the alums out here, if you've gone out around the world and you tell them if you're from Shaker Heights, they probably assume that you're very wealthy, which is not necessarily true. But it was a very wealthy place. And that article, which was titled "The Good Life in Shaker Heights," was the line on the cover of the magazine. Really described this sense of suburban opulence, this place, sort of the American dream. In fact, the article said, "This is a story of an American dream town come true." So that was my original thought of this, was that this is sort of this dream town, this idea of the best of what America has to offer. But yet that was in 1963, which is the same year that Martin Luther King's March on Washington occurred. In fact, it's, I believe, 60 years ago this week. And where he talked about a different kind of American dream. And that's a dream that this place is also trying to make come true. So when I thought about the title, I thought about this is both of those things. And frankly, it might imply that it's a place where all of that has come true. And if you read the book, you'll see that's not the case. If you live here, you'll know that's not the case. All these dreams have not, this is no nirvana. Shaker was actually, the original land was occupied by the Shakers, religious cult, which was actually very much about building a utopia. And ever since then, this is a place that has tried and thought of itself as aspiring to different versions of utopia. And it is not that. But I do think it is a place that is still dreaming and still is. And when you think of the word dream, when I think about the word dream, I really think of it as a verb as much as an adjective.
Sort of a present progressive, that is, we continue to dream, we are dreaming.
Exactly.
So, I mean, you grew up here, you know the school system very, very well. You've now immersed yourself in certainly past, present thoughts about the future. What surprised you during your journey?
So I knew the big picture of Shaker story, from living here. And I will say that I'll say a word about just growing up here. I have felt enormous pride being from Shaker Heights. At the time, I sort of viewed us as a special place. And in my mind, I kind of thought of it as, well, you guys out there in the rest of America, you have problems with race, but we've got this figured out here. It was sort of that idea that this a bit of rose-colored glasses. And I, of course, knew it wasn't perfect. I was in advanced classes and they were predominantly white. But I kind of assumed everybody was getting a good education because the schools are so good. The schools were excellent. Everybody knew that. And in my I'll say a word about what really shaped my views on race, and that I think is Shaker Heights gets the credit for, was my next door neighbors growing up, the Lardy family, and Jim Lardy is here right now. The dad of this family, 2 white parents, 6 children, 5 of them adopted, 4 children of color. My best friend as a little kid was his daughter, Betsy, biracial girl. And when I remember asking my dad, why Betsy was part Black and part white, he told me just sort of matter-of-factly, one of her biological parents was white and one was Black. And it was just that simple. And growing up next to this family was incredibly influential for me. So that all of that just sort of set the stage. So what surprised me, to actually get around to your question, I knew that there would be Black families, Black parents, Black students who experienced instances of bias and racism. But I was genuinely shocked by how common those stories were. virtually every single Black parent who I've talked to and Black student who I've talked to has at least one story of sometimes it's something serious, sometimes it's something small, but of being looked at differently because of their race, being treated differently, not being given the same opportunities. And it was truly shocking to me how prevalent that was. Like, how is this happening here in this community? But it absolutely has happened, and I'm sure is still happening.
You know, you remind me, you heard that we had done a film at ABC called The Reunion about my kindergarten class. And it reminds me of a story that my classmate Karen Holmes told in that film about her, I think, 10th or 11th grade AP English class, where the group of a couple of white girls who were in the class, friends, would turn their papers in and they would get A's, and the Black girls would turn their papers in and they would get B's. And they were all friends. And so one day they switched papers. And Karen tells the story of how the Black girls got B's and the white girls got A's. And that's a classic example of implicit bias that, that has happened and certainly is not a surprise to many of us.
I mean, I'll tell a quick story. Another way that this manifests itself. I spent a lot of time at the high school. Thanks in part to the generosity of the principal who's here, who let me roam the halls. I don't know if you realized I was roaming the halls. And popping into classes. And I was in this one class, and it was an English class, and it was I believe it was a combination class of regular and honors. And there was this one girl in there who was Black, who was just so sharp. She was just had such great answers to every question. She was engaged in the conversation. Afterwards, I started talking to her. This is 11th grade. And she was in the honors version of this class. And I said, well, why were you in this class? What did you consider taking advanced placement? And she said, well, yeah, I was in it for one day and it just didn't feel comfortable. It didn't feel right. There weren't, I was one of the only Black students there. I didn't really feel like I belonged in that class. So I talked to my counselor and she said I could change to honors. And that was what happened. And it was just so sad to me that, number one, she felt that way in the first place, that she felt like she didn't belong in that room. And that, number two, when she went to her counselor, the counselor didn't say, you know what, we're going to get you some support. We're going to find some people for you to talk to. We're going to make this work for you because I know you can do it. Nobody said that. They just said, oh, honors is also great. You can be in the honors class. And that's just how it went.
And that's also surprising to you.
It isn't, no one of these stories is surprising to me. What was surprising to me was how many and how widespread it was. It's just, it's truly ubiquitous. So that's what surprised me. And the other thing, and then this is a corollary to that, has to do with the leveling system, which, as many of you know, because so many of us went to Shaker schools, when we were there, and for many, many years, there's a pretty aggressive leveling system where you were either in, when I was there, it was called level 3, 4, 5. There was also a level 2, maybe there went, and actually I do know at one point there was a level 1. You were placed into these levels and into these tracks. And, theoretically you could change year to year, but really that didn't really happen as a practical matter. And I knew that this system had been criticized, but I was also surprised by how far back that criticism went. There was, for instance, I knew there was a investigation from the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, but it turns out there were actually 3 investigations over the years of the level system and the disproportionate placement of white and Black students. I knew a little bit, but I learned more about in 1980, a very, very critical report from the Urban League about what was happening with the level system. But the one that really, and this was probably the single piece of my research that was just personally the most shocking, was when I was doing research at the high school in the archives in the basement. There's a bunch of boxes, and I was looking through these boxes.
Wait, how'd you find the boxes?
You tell the story of the boxes.
Tell the story. Tell the story.
Well, the story of the box. I told this the other night, so if some of you are there, you may have heard this. But I was having lunch with Mark Freeman, the former superintendent, and he said, "Well, have you seen the boxes in the high school?" I said, "No, what box?" He goes, "Well, there are boxes. there's boxes in the high school basement. Okay. So I go to the current spokesperson and said, can I see the boxes in the high school basement? He goes, I don't know what you're talking about. I said, well, we'll ask somebody about the boxes. So he asked somebody. It turns out, yep, there's boxes. In fact, turns out I've been down in that room. There are a lot of boxes. Most of them are not that interesting, but there are a couple shelves of very interesting boxes of documents. And so I was going through one of them and I get to the very end. It was on an unrelated topic. There's this academic paper that was written by a former Shaker graduate who is now at Harvard. And he wrote this for a sociology class. And he talked about how pernicious the level system was and how it had evolved into becoming something racist. This is a white student writing this.
What
And
year,
then-
what year was that written?
And that's what I'm getting to, that the shocking part to me, again, was not that this paper was written. It was when it was written. It was written in 1969. I mean, this paper was in 1969. He's talking about the level system evolving into something racist. I mean, there was still I don't know what exactly the Black percentage in the school district was then, but it was relatively small. And I saw that and my jaw dropped open. And I really felt like, I actually felt enormous sadness that this had been known about for so long and it was still with us.
Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about leveling and about the achievement gap, which we know persists here. But I thought we'd talk a little bit about the structure of the book. And if you would tell us about the Van Swearingens, because it's a great chapter.
Well, the Van Swearingens, who I did not have the opportunity to interview, sadly, and I would have liked to because they seem like super weird people. OP and MJ Van Swearingens, who founded this community. The irony with them is that they grew up in poverty. They then created this community, which was to be the best of everything, the highest standards. And I can assure you their version of utopia did not include anything about racial equity. It was very much about keeping people out and getting the right sort of people in. And I think the reason that chapter is important is both because it established some things that, people really love about Shaker, the wonderful architecture, the way the roads curve with the topography, the greenery, the fact that we don't have, industry around the corner. I mean, there's a lot of things that were really wonderful, but they also were set out to make this extremely exclusive and overtly racist. So it sort of sets the stage for the story that comes next. And actually, I mean, maybe we should just talk about while we're talking about the story that comes next. I mean, the next chapter talks about when the first Black families moved into Shaker Heights, and in fact, the first Black family to move into the Shaker Heights School District was yours. So I think it actually makes sense for you to tell us that story.
Well, let's get that in a second. But actually, no, there was a doctor who moved in early, right?
Well, he tried.
He
He
tried.
did. He lived here for a time. There was a doctor who lived on Huntington, just around the corner from my dad and stepmom's house. And this was in 1925. And he was absolutely harassed by the Shaker Heights police. There was a big meeting at the high school to talk about what they could do to get rid of undesirables. It's a lovely term that is. And a renewed effort after that to have homeowners add covenants to their leases, which gave the Van Swearingen Company veto power over any future buyers. So yes, they stayed for a short time, but eventually they left. I mean, not eventually, soon after they left.
So if we fast forward to 1955, early in 1955, my parents secretly acquired a lot in the Shaker Heights School District, but in Cleveland, but in the Shaker Heights School District in the Ludlow community. And they acquired the lot. My father and mother had purchased 2 lots at about 155th and Harvard. And my father had a friend, a teammate from his football days at Western Reserve, who owned a single buildable lot in Ludlow. And they traded. And because they traded, there was no trace of the property exchange. And so then my father hired an architect, Art Saunders, whose daughter is also class of 73, little shout out there. And Art was astute and said, well, if a Black architect signs these drawings, chances are they're not going to get through the Shaker Heights Architectural Review Board. And so he had a white colleague stamp the drawings and submit them. And then we had to, my parents had to submit to the city of Cleveland, and they had their documents basically hidden among, a passel of documents that a friend who was on the council was putting through, and that got through as well. And so, so it was not until my father and Art Saunders and Leroy Ozan and Ralph Tyler showed up to essentially do the surveying of the property and stake out where the foundation was going to be built in about March of 1955 that the neighbors figured out that there were going to be new neighbors.
And I actually think what's interesting, well, of course, that story is fascinating, and it shows what great lengths Black families had to go to get into communities like this. Truly remarkable. And your parents were remarkable people who I also didn't have a chance to meet, but just from learning about them through you and through others. I'll just mention his mom worked for the school district for many, many years, running the first Shaker Schools busing plan and doing many other leadership roles there. Just really, really huge contributors to this community. After that, the neighbors figured out who was coming, and there were a couple other Black families at the same time. One notably the Pegs. What did they do? Well, in an echo of 1925, they had a meeting at this time at Ludlow Elementary School where they had their own conversation. What are we going to do? What are we going to do about these? In fact, there was conversation. Maybe we should do the same thing, but try to enforce the deeds, try to get these people vetoed. It was a complete echo of what had happened when the doctor moved in 1925. But the thing that was different this time was that after the meeting, there were a handful of people who left and said, you know what, this doesn't sit right. This feels really wrong, and we need to push back against this. And, of course, it's 30 years later, but that was the beginning. That was the beginning. Right after that meeting was the seeds of what came next, which was the Peg's house was firebombed. The garage was destroyed. And there were a lot of people who thought that it was racially motivated. They never found out what the reason was, but it was a good guess. And the same group of people came back together and said, this is not okay. And they showed up on the day when their workers were there cleaning the debris up, and they brought coffee and they brought cookies. And of course, the coffee and the cookies were nice, but what was much more important was the fact that they were there making a statement. And then that ultimately led to the creation of the Ludlow Community Association, which did a remarkable amount of work to keep that neighborhood integrated as white flight began almost immediately. And the irony was first Black families can't get in, the realtors won't show you the house, banks won't write a loan. But then once Black people are in, now white people can't get in because now it's risky. Now it's a neighborhood in transition. Now it's an unsafe investment. So they can't get their loans. The realtors are telling them. I talked to one person who's was told by the realtor, you don't want to live anywhere near Shaker Square. That place is going to be destroyed within 5 years. That the whole community is falling apart. And so this Ludlow Community Association formed to push back against all of that. And then eventually that ethos spread to the rest of the community.
How are we doing?
I think we're okay. No one's left.
And so the story, or essentially the demand for housing and the demand to push the integration moved to other neighborhoods.
Yeah, it did. And we should tell the story of another person who was really influential in that, which was Reverend Albert M. Pennybacker. I understand that his daughter was also in your class, and she's here too. It's nice to see you. He was another remarkable figure in Shaker Heights history. Was not here for that long, only about a little over a decade, but at a critical point. And he helped the community understand that as integration was moving, as Black families were arriving to other neighborhoods, to Moreland, to Lomond, to Sussex, where I grew up, that they had a choice that they could either, push back against this and essentially it'd be an ugly and likely losing fight, or you could embrace the fact, embrace integration and try to look for something better, something new.
There's actually a great quote in the book from Reverend Pennybacker, and I wonder if you could take a look at that. Page 70.
Well, this,
I happen to have it.
I got it here. Yeah, well, there was actually a program at Woodbury Junior High, as it was called then. And the title of the program was The Negro in Shaker Heights. So they were just getting right to it with the title, what this program was about. There were 3 people on the panel. One of them was Joe Finley, who was a leader in the Ludlow Community Association. He was arguing for open housing. The second person was Wilson Stapleton, a former mayor of Shaker Heights, who had made his views of integration clear when he was mayor. There was a straw purchase, which means a white family buys the house and turns it over to a black family on Alderside, just a block from the high school. People went crazy and he completely defended the neighbors who were angry about this, said people who don't desire infiltration shouldn't have to have it. So, by the way, his portrait is still hangs in City Hall. You can see what this guy looks like if you want. He's a white guy, just in case you're not sure. And old white guy. Anyway, so also the third person on that panel was Reverend Pennybacker. And he had been in Shaker for just a couple months at this point. He was the pastor of Heights Christian Church. And the idea that, he would just spoke right truth to power. He said that Shaker has a choice. He said, shall we face the future with our heads between our legs running backwards, hoping that our wolfish fears will run away? Or shall we assemble our resources in an intelligent, responsible, morally sound manner and together walk erect into our community's future? And of course, one speech didn't get it done, but he continued to work with other people in the community. And ultimately the powers that be in the city, came to realize that they were better off embracing diversity and being seen as a place that championed it than to being seen as a place that was fighting it. And then the second twist that happened was it wasn't just we're embracing it, we're a pioneer. We're a national model, and then it was the pride that came with this. And I believe that what things ultimately changed was because people who didn't like that left and people who were drawn to that arrived. And that ultimately remade the community into people who were interested.
It's an interesting sort of exercise in rebranding, isn't it?
Very much so. Absolutely. And rebrandings aren't easy, often they fail, but this one managed to work and in a really remarkable way.
So next in this saga is the question about, well, is Shaker going to become the single place in the eastern suburbs and the single destination for Black people? And there's another story in your book about some efforts about that.
Yeah. So there was enormous pressure on Shaker Heights and also on Cleveland Heights. There were the 2 suburbs that were open. This was the phrase, open to Black buyers. There was a huge amount of demand for housing as there were more Black families moving into the middle class, living in the city, looking for better schools, looking for better housing. And so they were arriving, and both communities had these integration plans. And we should note that what those integration plans was we want white people. Now, this doesn't sound, when you put it that way, like super progressive, but that's what it was, is that if we want to maintain this neighborhood as integrated, as racially balanced, we need to counteract what's going to happen on its own due to both the incredible demand from Black buyers and also what the real estate industry was doing, steering people towards what the banks were doing. And so they were trying to encourage white people. So, but I think they knew it was always going to be a losing battle as long as there were no other options. So an amazing thing happened, and we'll talk about this because this is another, I believe, the class of 1973 is well represented in this book, I have to say. Winston Ritchie, who was a one of the early Ludlow families, a Black man who not only helped integrate Ludlow, he then integrated Mercer, to, brought his family to East, said we got to keep spreading out. Can't have the same people in the same neighborhoods.
Also became the first Black member on the city
First
council,
Black member of the city council.
ran
very
for
first.
mayor, did not win, but ran for mayor.
He did. And when he lost that race for mayor, he, at the same time, what Shaker and Cleveland Heights were doing was another truly a remarkable thing, is they set up an office funded by the school districts and the cities to try to talk Black people into moving to other suburbs, what were called the Hillcrest suburbs. I don't know if other people know, they're called like Mayfield Heights and Garfield, like this places out there. They were trying to attract people out there. So they were essentially trying, and not that these communities really were like wanting these people to move there. This was like a office run by Winston Ritchie, set up in this area to say, like, essentially advertise these communities. And like there were some great stories about how they did it. You know, he would, for instance, give a award, like a award for humanitarianism or for like civil rights or something that, you know, seemed really like celebrating diversity award, something like this, to like a city official in, say, Mayfield Heights, and then tell like the Black newspapers about it and get that in there that they won this award, so that therefore people were, oh, that might be a good place to go. So they were, as he put it, good mouthing these places, not bad mouthing them. And so people would be drawn there. And that is, I mean, another remarkable thing. I don't know of any other case where one community funds an office to try to persuade people to move to another community.
But in the end, I mean, if you look back on it, it was a brilliant strategy to basically open up the rest of the east side of the city.
Exactly, because it was never going to work if you only have two places that are welcoming. It just, the numbers don't work out. You can't do that. So they were trying to do that. And then it wasn't just about getting them in, it was also about supporting them once they were there, helping them meet people, helping them get adjusted to the schools, all sorts of things. So yes, absolutely.
And no good deed goes unpunished, right?
Not very often.
What we also know is that despite all of our best efforts, or even maybe our not very good efforts, there remains an achievement gap. And it's pernicious, and a lot has been considered about it. I think there's been a lot nationally written about it. And yet here in the dream town, it persists. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you know, either both here and nationally, about the achievement gap, and what Shaker is doing about it?
Well, Shaker has done an enormous number of things over the years, and a lot of those things are still there. I mean, there is a program called Max Scholars, which is for young Black men, and there's sister scholars for young women in high school to encourage achievement and have positive role models, and celebrate improvements in grades and high grades. There's free tutoring available. You know, I wish there was free tutoring available in my home district, but there is free tutoring available for anyone who wants it. Of course, there's like this, well, that's not specific with achievement gap. I actually wrote a few things to make sure I didn't forget anything. There is, I mean, one thing that I think is really important. Well, let me just back up for a second. The achievement gap is driven, I think, you know, by two major factors, both of which are pernicious and very difficult to address. One is economics. As a whole, the Black community in Shaker Heights is much less wealthy than the white community is. And that divide has grown over time. And nationally, we know that kids from lower income families do not do as well in school as kids from upper income families. And the reasons for that are vast. I mean, the resources that families have to support their kids, what they're bringing with them when they walk in the door is just vastly different. It makes a big difference of whether you spent your summer, you know, working a job to help income for the family, or you spent your summer at science camp. I mean, those are two different experiences, and they both have value, but one of them is going to help you do better in science. if you show up and you didn't get a good night's sleep because you're sharing a bedroom with a sibling who doesn't sleep well, maybe you're not as ready to learn as somebody who has their own room and they got a great night's sleep. There are just 1,000 examples like that. And and this is not just a Shaker situation. This is and I don't mean to paint with a broad brush. There is a wide range of families, both Black and white and other races as well in this community. And there's a wide range of experiences, but those are systemic issues. And then there's also the issues of systemic racism that are also part of the Shaker schools too. And a lot of high income Black families told me the same stories about lower expectations and not being told about the same opportunities. So this is a great story. I mean, it's just a small one, but sometimes I think small stories tell a lot. There's a kid who I talked to, he's an adult now, went to Shaker schools, grew up in the Lomond area, super bright. I mean, I'll just note he did, go on. He got a law degree from the University of Michigan, in case you're wondering how bright he really is. And he's at summer school taking typing. And an assistant principal sees him in the hallway and says, listen, don't worry about that grade, the class you didn't do well in. You're going to make it up this summer and you're going to be right on track for the fall. Thought he just assumed he was there because he had failed a class. He said, I'm here for typing, so I don't need that speech, but he just assumed. So, I mean, that kid did fine, but what does that do to you? What does that do to your self-esteem when you have an administrator assuming that you failed, when in fact you're a great student? So I think there are a lot of explanations for the achievement gap, and Shaker has not solved the problem.
And we can get back to the question about leveling. A critic would look at Shaker and say, in part because of leveling, if you look at the school, it's really two schools in one. It is intensely segregated, and despite best intentions, perhaps, it has remained that way for many, many years.
Yes, it has for many, many years, which is why in 2020, the current superintendent made the decision to do something called detracking, which is combining kids of different ability levels in the same classes. The idea is that everybody should be taught to the same high standards. The idea is that if you set a kid on a lower track from a young age, and tracking began in Shaker at a young age, formally in 5th grade. I mean, 5th grade is young. I have a 5th grader. He's young, like the idea that his future would be set right now based on how he's perceived is frightening, but that's what was happening. And so the idea was to collapse these classes and have everybody learn together, have classrooms that look like Shaker, have diverse hallways and diverse classrooms. It's hard to do. It's hard to do. It's hard to do well. And it's been somewhat of a struggle, but it's one that they're working through.
That sounds awfully complicated.
Yes, it is.
And it sounds like that puts both a significant burden on teachers and how to teach but it also, the implementation of it has been a little questionable. Is that right?
Well, it was implemented in fall of 2020 in the height of the pandemic, which was perhaps part of the reason was politically it was easier to do because frankly, people weren't paying that close attention. And there were other reasons too, but that I think was one of them. And, but that was a bad time for education. It was, I think, a low point, it's fair to say. You had teachers trying to teach online. You had students who had maybe not even been to school for the previous spring. You had morphed into these horrible hybrid classes where a teacher is teaching some kids in the room and other kids on the computer. It was a very, very hard time. So I think adding another piece was really hard, and without an opportunity for training or preparation, and also really hard for students. Student who hadn't done well maybe last year and now suddenly is being moved up with not a lot of preparation into what's supposed to be an honors class for the next year. I'm going to add, because Eric Julie, the principal, is here, that the explanation that he and others gave me for why this happened then, and it's a compelling one, which is that because of the pandemic, there was a need to cohort students, which means keep students in small groups so you don't spread the virus. And if you cohort students, that means that if two white kids are together for honors math, that means they're going to be together for everything. They're going to be together for gym. They're going to be together for choir. They're going to be together for things they don't, their entire schedule. And essentially you're going to have segregation where you don't need it. And a system that was already bad would get even worse. So there's an argument for doing it. But I think there were also arguments against doing it then. But regardless, that was 3 years ago, and we're past that, and we're like into it. There's 3 years of experience. There has been more training, and I've heard both good things from teachers, people who have found good things, parents who like it, and I've witnessed what I think are like positive moments in classrooms that you see where it may be working. And there's some early data from the district that they're excited about that shows that the math scores of Black students have risen in 8th grade algebra. But I've also heard a lot of critics. So I think that this is very much a work in progress.
You know, as we've said, my mother worked in the schools and worked in particularly in the voluntary busing program for years. And I can remember for years watching my mother a few days a week come home and just feel as though she had the weight of the world on her shoulders. You know, engaging in this and engaging this on a daily basis, it's hard. And yet I think she would say engaging in it is better than the alternative. And that's why she wakes up the next day and does it again. You and I were talking the other day, and you were talking a little bit about despair, and you had a question about that. Someone questioned you about that, and I wondered if you wanted to reflect a little bit about that.
I can't remember exactly. I've talked to you so often. It's hard for me to remember every thought I utter. But I think that, I mean, you can walk away from this story feeling a sense of despair and feeling like, well, and in times when I was reporting this and writing this book, I wondered, like, what would my ultimate conclusion be? You know, is this a story of failure? Is this a story? And some people who have read the book think it is a story of failure, that you tried and well, it's too hard, just too hard. But that really isn't where I landed. I feel like that work that your mom did, that people like her throughout the community today are still doing, is incredibly impressive. And the fact is that people are still at it. And it's a day in, day out, week in, week out, decade in, decade out effort. It isn't something that we're going to ever probably be able to, hoist a mission accomplished banner and say, okay, let's move on. This isn't like, okay, I lost 30 pounds on a juice fast, and now it's all better. It's more like, God, I got to stop eating Cheetos every day. It's just a very hard thing. And I'm incredibly impressed and still very proud to be from this place that is a place that cares and that is working at it. And that's where I landed at the end of the day.
I think we have some time for questions.
Okay.
Good afternoon. First, I want to thank you and Paul for having this forum. I see that 73 is well represented. I see my cousin up there, Paula. Hi, how are you? I want to also pay homage to our parents, the Holmeses, Adrians, Pennybacker, Stevens, Carmen, all of them. They did incredible work to support us and to shield us from so much stuff. They did have an association. The Black parents did get together and they discussed all these issues in order to make sure that their children had a decent education. I also want to say that back in 1993, I did my dissertation on Shaker schools. specifically on African-American males who have been disenfranchised in the system. I looked at 3 different high schools. Shaker was one. The outcome in terms of tracking, where you have the 1, 2, 3, 4, was deliberate and is a system that was exercised and implemented among a lot of urban school centers across the country, okay? At the end of the day, what was found for the dissertation was that the African-American males had a 50% attrition rate from 9th to 12th grade. That means 50% of all African-American males who attended Shaker in the 9th grade were gone by the 5th grade, okay? We also had an issue in terms of the average grade, averaging out. That was C- for Shaker schools. I worked with Mark Freeman. Mark Freeman didn't tell me about any boxes. And I was there. He didn't tell me about any boxes. The other thing in terms of recommendations, and then I'll sit down, was one of the recommendations was dealing with this stratification because it was not a healthy nor robust way to address the achievement gap. That was one recommendation, that all these classes need to be integrated because research has shown for years that if children are exposed to an advanced curriculum, they all learn at the same pace, okay? Regardless of socioeconomic status, regardless of how many beds they sleep in, whatever. When you give children a chance and they're exposed, they rise to the occasion. The second thing was to have mentorship program for the African-American males, in particular at Shaker schools. It was never done, okay? So these are some of the recommendations that were made back in 1993, 94.
So Denise, perhaps somebody read your paper because it seems as though some of that now the schools are trying to implement.
Did you read my dissertation?
No, I didn't read it, but I'm just saying I've listened closely to what you said.
Right, so I just wanted to say that because I did put a lot of work in. I just wanted.
There's been so much wonderful work done on
Thank you.
Shaker schools. Yes. I just want to say that I saw your paper when I was doing research, and a lot of other there's been amazing academic work done on the Shaker schools, and this book definitely benefited from it.
Was her paper in the box in the basement?
I don't think so. Not sure.
We have another question. Yes.
Oh.
You point out I'm going to pick out 2 out of your 3 purposes in writing the book. One, what will it take to fulfill the promise of racial integration in America? And 2, whether Shaker has achieved that goal, and that's what you've discussed. But you also point out 3 individuals, 3 groups going at cross purposes, defeating the same. A teacher who earnestly in an advanced placement class tries, has good reputation to educate her children, Black, white, green, purple. And she has a student who has not read the assignments, has not fulfilled the assignments, playing with her phone, playing with her hair. And the teacher, as she would with any group, asks why. That's called bullying. You have a student, again, who doesn't give a damn about where she is in an advanced class. Why is she there if she doesn't care? You have a school board and an administration who has a knee-jerk reaction, afraid that maybe people will, Shaker Heights picket, Black Lives Matter or whatever, and has a knee-jerk reaction of stopping this teacher without any discussion. And I'll add a 4th. You have a school board here that has a levy bond issue coming up in November. Very expensive for those of us who have homes. However, with this bond issue coming up, it's for new buildings. We have beautiful architecture. We have beautiful.
I'm sorry, is there can I just ask?
May I finish, please?
Yeah.
And then you have your turn. Thank you.
I'm sorry, is there a question?
The question and the point is, why isn't this money for the levy and the bond issue being used to improve the quality of, help the teachers improve their quality, help the students with tutoring and extra programs to bring them up to a higher level? Why? And you can talk about your school.
Oh,
but
so-
this is the question.
Okay,
Why
I-
isn't more done now?
uh-huh.
Achieve the
Well,
success.
Let me just try to respond to that in a couple ways. All right, just from a factual point of view, I want to confirm what school board member just said, which is that the bond issue that's on the ballot is not for new buildings, it's for renovations. There was an earlier proposal for new buildings that was not endorsed by the school board, and it was one of the options on the table that was rejected. So whether it's should vote for it or not, it's not my place to say, but it is not for new buildings. The second, what the school should use their money for, that's beyond my scope as well. That's a conversation that should be had, but whether buildings are more urgent than other needs that I believe that there is money in the bond issue for pre-K as well, which is certainly an academic piece. And just finally, I want to address but you already put a lot on the table. I don't know if you've read the book yet or not, but okay, well, I hope you read the book itself. What you were referring to was a controversy that happened in 2018 with a teacher named Jody Podol, an AP English teacher, and a student in her class. There's a whole chapter about that incident, which is a very complicated one. You gave one way of looking at it. There are other ways of looking at it too. I make very clear in the chapter that I do not think the district handled it well. But I do think that it was a very complicated situation. And one thing that I've been most happy about this book is people who have read it have told me that they think that chapter was a very balanced chapter that really helps us understand the points of view of everybody who was in that very difficult situation, which it was a difficult situation. So you can definitely have an opinion, and there's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. But I would love to hear what you think about how I handled that if you do choose to read the book after you read that chapter.
We have a question from the online audience. I'm over here. So one of the questions is, how did the period of time differ between the 1950s and 60s and the 1970s and 80s with respect to the integration of the schools in academic achievement? Was there a difference in quality of what was being done during the 50s and 60s as compared to the 70s and 80s?
Was there a difference in the achievement gap itself, or
What was being done
to address it?
Address the achievement gap sort of qualitatively different?
I mean, much more was addressed over time, because I mean, in the 50s, well, first of all, in the 50s, the percentage of Black students in the Shaker schools was virtually none. I mean, just a handful of kids in Ludlow in the late 50s. And the 60s, it was, it slowly was rising, but was still a distinct minority. So it wasn't really until you got into the 70s and 80s where you started to see larger numbers of students, and then the achievement gaps became more apparent. So I don't think that those two times really are comparable.
We have a question over here.
Thank you.
Where?
Hi.
Oh, good.
Hi, I apologize for coming in late, so you may have answered my question. I am a 1967 graduate from Shaker Heights. My sister's a 1964 graduate of Shaker Heights. There were, I think, 12 African Americans out of 600 in my sister's class. I'm pointing over here because my sister's over here. 12 out of 600 in her class, and about 50 African Americans out of 600 in my class. But what I recollect, sister, my mom said, who is 75% Caucasian, that she purposely met the realtor without my father. So that goes into what you were talking about earlier. Again, I came in late, so you may have addressed this, but what was your personal motivation? You're a Shaker graduate?
Yes.
And I'm sorry, I haven't read your book yet. I think Shaker has it on order. They don't have it in yet, I don't think. No offense.
They don't have
Shaker,
it
I
in
love
yet.
Shaker. Well,
Me again.
they-
I'm taking back what I had
I
to
already
say.
asked for it. They said, no, we don't have it yet. But I'm sure they're getting it real fast, right, guys? And what was your personal motivation for
My
writing
personal
this book?
motivation, yeah.
Thank
no,
you.
No, it's a good question and it's not one that we actually addressed. So I just started out, so I was just a reporter. You know, I was when I started doing this reporting, I was at the Wall Street Journal. I was not somebody who writes books. I had never written a book before. I had never particularly aspired to write a book before. In fact, I was at a seminar once where they talked about book writing, where they said, and I quote, something to the effect of, don't write a book because you think people will read it, because they probably won't. And don't write a book because you think it'll be easy, because it definitely won't. And on and on and on. And I thought, well, no, thank you. This sounds like a terrible idea. But I decided to write an article for the paper about the Shaker schools. And it started out when I was at the Journal. I spent a long time on it. I brought it with me to the Washington Post, where I now am. And as I was working on the article, I felt like there was such a rich story that even though the article was quite long when it ran, it was 6,000 words, which is long for a newspaper article. But I still felt I was just barely scratching the surface. And my editor said to me at one point, well, that sentence or that paragraph, that could be a whole chapter. And I just started thinking, there is so much more to say. And I felt like my background, both as growing up here and staying in touch with the community over the years, combined with my perspective as a journalist, I felt like that I was a person who could bring this story to life. And even though there's been enormous amount of academic research done about Shaker, there's Paul's film, there was another documentary done on Shaker, nobody had ever written a book about it. And I thought, well, a book for the general public. And I thought that was something that I could contribute. 1986.
There's another online question. Can you briefly address the concerns raised in the January 2023 New York Times article titled, "Could Black Flight Change a Model of Integration?" which raised concerns among the Black community about detracking. Among other things, it quoted a Black former Shaker resident as saying, "The parents who had the means and who were Black and with Black kids who were high performing, they left Shaker."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thought that article both had some big truths in it and also some problems. There really is no evidence that Black families are leaving Shaker due to detracking. The data that was in that piece and was gathered before detracking even happened. So I don't think that we can say whether there's a cause and effect there, but more broadly speaking, it got at a bigger truth, which is that over time, the Black population in Shaker has grown less wealthy as a group. And that is due both to the fact that Shaker there are more opportunities for lower income people to come into the city due to a lot of things that happened with the housing crisis and other changes. And at the same time, there are more options for higher income Black families than there were, say, at the time when Paul's family arrived, where, and soon after, for a long time, Shaker was one of the only places you could go. Now there are many options. So, and there certainly are some high achieving Black families who are uncomfortable with the racial dynamics that are in Shaker. There's no doubt about it. There are a lot of high achieving Black kids who feel lonely, just like the girl I told you about in these advanced classes, or feel a sense of conflict in their own identity. If I've got my friends in my classes and then I've got different social circle, and that's not easy. So those are some of the things that I think that are going on and that have been going on for a while. It helps explain these overall macroeconomic trends.
Eileen. No, I'm sorry. No, the young woman, the young woman here from the class of 73.
A lot of us are here for the 50th reunion and we're very nostalgic. And I loved every second of being part of Shaker. And I will tell you from my perspective, it changed everything I did in college, everything I did as a teacher and a doctor. And tell me something good. So you did a lot of interviews. Tell me, and maybe Paul, you can tell me something. Why was it so good for us? Or was it good? Because my heart broke when you told the story about the changing of the papers. And that was something I was ignorant of. And so again, I grew up in this community. I felt a part of everyone, and I think it changed my life, but clearly I didn't feel it in the same way as other people. But just tell me something good, because I do believe that you'll never find another district, you'll never find another opportunity to be a better person and to be aware of humanity than at least when I was here in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s.
I mean, I think that that's still true. And I would say, yeah, yes. There, and I don't mean to be despondent or to be too much of a downer on what is still a remarkable community, and people I've talked to, Black and white people who are part of this community and who are alums like we are, have wonderful, warm feelings about growing up here. And growing up in a diverse community, even with its problems, has changed the course of many of our lives and helped us see the world in new and better ways. And that is something that I think that is almost a truism. So I know even people who had bad experiences and who told stories like this often also had warm feelings about, the kid who told the story about the typing class, that he was here for typing. He loved Shaker. He said he grew up and he was much more prepared to live in a diverse world than he would have been if he had been in an all Black community. It is absolutely a wonderful place. I truly believe that. I truly have warm feelings about this. So, but that doesn't mean that you don't look at it critically also. And you say like, okay, where is this falling short? And what has that story been? That is also part of the story. And if we just turn a blind eye to that, I think it's easy. I'll tell one other thing. Like I also had, a good experience, certainly academically, a very good experience in Shaker. And I was talking to somebody in the community who told me a story about her English teacher, this is a Black woman, who discouraged her from taking advanced placement English. Said, in my experience, African-Americans don't do well in this class. She told her that. And then told me who it was. It was the same person I had for English, and I had a great experience with her. She never told me that there are some white kids that don't do well. So I think as white people, we often are not aware of what's going on, even as we're having good experiences, to what is happening with some of our peers. And that's just the world we live in. And we, the more we can kind of think about that and pay attention to that, I think the richer this experience is for all of us.
Let me introduce myself a little. It's only fair. Couple minutes. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, my name's Vilma Seaborg, and I am one of those academics who wrote a book about Shaker schools, and it came out 2 years ago. And the question I have is, I think what's really needed now, and I wonder if you agree with this, is that we need a rebranding of the whole notion of Black-white relationships in the schools, away from this achievement gap nonsense, which is just a distraction from what's really going on. What's really going on is that we don't recognize yet that Black families contribute things to the schools that are specific, special, and hugely important for any democratic country, any democratic society. And I wonder if you think this rebranding might be something that's going to move out of the Black Lives Matter movement into the general population, Shaker people, general population, who are not all Black, to understand that the generational trauma does affect your everyday interactions with people who haven't gone through that. And in addition to that, the immense moral fortitude and courage that people have brought to the schools who are people of color and who have been marginalized all along in our schools, and all your stories tell that. You think we're ready to rebrand to become that kind of a community?
Can I just say, I think I was the one who used the term rebrand. And I think I was saying it within the context of what the Van Sweringen set up initially as was the model of what Shaker Heights was supposed to be versus what the Ludlow Community Association and others then began to create here. And what Reverend Pennybacker said, are we going to put our heads in the sand? Or are we going to move to the future? And I think that's what I was saying when in talking about rebranding. And I don't want Laura to feel as though she's held to what I said, but
I don't, in general, I'm not, I would want to think more about all the nuances of what you just said before giving a really thoughtful answer. But my general feeling is that rebrandings are not the answer, that's more about the PR of it all. And that while that matters, there's also like, you need to deal with the substance underneath, and there is both positive and negative. And I understand, I think what you're getting at is a lot of focus and maybe obsession on the negative, and that we need to focus on a lot of the wonderful things. And I understand that. And I think that Shaker Heights employs a lot of people whose job is to send out messages about the wonderful things happening. And I think that that's all to the good, because there are many wonderful things happening.
We have time for one more question, Paul.
well, there's a gentleman here who's had his hand raised for quite a while. Hold on, we've got a microphone coming to you.
I went to Shaker and I was an average student and I didn't think they cared about us. And I also want to know, I happen to be Jewish. Did the Jewish population help with the blacks? Since we were also discriminated.
Well, I'll say a couple words about the Jewish population. There were a lot of members of the Ludlow Community Association who were Jewish, who were very active, and that were a big part of what happened there. Of course, Shaker has had a substantial Jewish population for a long time, so I wouldn't want to paint all of them with any one brush in terms of whether they were helpful or not. I will tell a little less inspiring story about one Jewish person from Shaker, who was the president of Shaker Savings and Loan Bank, who helped open up a lot of Shaker to Jewish buyers, but in fact also actively worked to prevent Black people from buying. So there is a range, just like with anything else, a range of experiences of a group that is that big. I'm sorry that you didn't have a good experience here.
So a couple words to wrap up, and then we're planning to have a signing line. So Laura's going to be over here at the table by the grand staircase. We're going to give her a minute to make her way over there before we mob her. But if you wanted to each say a word or two to wrap up before we finish.
Just want to thank you for all coming and for thoughtful questions. And I really appreciate it. These issues aren't easy. I don't want the worst thing would be for anybody to leave thinking that I think any of this is easy. I absolutely do not. These are hard issues, and there are a lot of people, thoughtful, committed people grappling with them. And that's why I remain hopeful about the future of this place, is that yes, there are problems, but there's so much commitment and so much focus on trying to take it on. And that matters.
Thank you. And can I simply say, thank you for your courtesy and for your questions. And thank you, Shaker class of 73. Huh? Yeah.